All right. Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction. I wanted it known that indeed I am a South African, in case anybody gets confused by my accent. I was a South African first, I'm a Canadian second, and I'll always be a South African. And what I'm going to speak to you about today is somewhat of a theory that I've developed over the years. So I teach a master's course at Harvard University. It's a course in supply chain management. It's a wonderful course. Students are absolutely great. And at the beginning of every semester, I look at the students, and the first question I ask them is, who is interested in supply chain management? Everybody's hands goes up. Everybody's hand, they reach for the sky, their eyes are bright, they look at me, everything's great. The second question I ask is, what is supply chain management? And the class becomes as quiet can be. No eye contact, nobody looks at me, nobody wants to be spoken to, nobody even wants to know, nobody even wants to be in the class. Now, I wouldn't dare try, but I would assume that if I asked the audience today what a human right is, a similar response might be received. Again, I'm not going to try. I have a theory. I believe that defining a set of human rights is meaningless. In fact, I believe it's dangerous. I believe defining a set of human rights without defining the roadmap for how to achieve those human rights leads to entitlement, leads to confusion, and is absolutely pointless. What I believe we should do is be defining a set of human standards and a roadmap for how we achieve our human rights. Okay, let me explain what I'm kind of getting at here. In order for human rights to make sense, they have to be clear. They have to be measurable. They have to be a shared vision in which an entire population believes in. And more importantly, specifically, maybe, they have to be driven by the population of which they serve. Each right has to be clearly defined. Each right must have a benchmark for which it's measured against. And each right has to have a target that it aims to hit. And at a given point, every year, every month, every day, what have you, it needs to be measured against that target. That's what I believe. Now, South Africa is a great country. I made a point of saying how proud I am of South Africa, how proud I am to be a South African. And in South Africa, we have a number of different rights. There is a right to adequate housing. There is a right to education. There's a right to health. There's a right to work. And for anyone who's ever visited South Africa, anyone who's ever lived in South Africa, anyone who's from South Africa, you know firsthand, without a doubt, that these rights are certainly not applicable to every human being simply because they are alive. There's poverty. There's crime. There's homelessness. There's unemployment. Some might say we are failing to educate. We are failing to employ. We are failing to shelter. And then we're punishing those who resort desperately in desperate measures to absolve our failures. Now, this isn't a problem that only South Africa faces. This is a problem that is an international problem, you could say. If you go to Canada, if you go to the US, if you go to the UK, you still see homelessness, you still see unemployment, you still see crime. Yet, the very definition of a human right, or human rights as a whole, suggests that we as humans have the ability and the right to overcome these obstacles. There's a problem here. Okay? There's a problem when we are told that we have the right, yet when you look around, you see people not knowing what that right means, how to get that right, how to achieve the right, and how to get to where they want to be. What we need to have is a supply chain of human rights. Okay, let me expand. Let me say what it is I'm trying to get to. Let me get to the bottom of this. A typical supply chain looks something like this. This is a crash course in supply chain management. Okay, a typical supply chain will look like this. There'll be a supplier, a manufacturer, a distributor, a retailer, and finally a consumer. What this means, pretty much nothing to most of you, but it's fine. Okay. Let's take an example and let's see how we look at this. So a typical supply chain would have a supplier that supplies raw materials, a manufacturer that manufactures those raw materials into an actual product, a distributor that houses those products, a retailer who sells it to the end user, and a consumer like you or I who goes into a store and purchases something. For the sake of using an example, we could say that the supplier might be a tree farm. A manufacturer might make those trees or those pieces of wood into chairs. The distributor might buy wholesale chairs, the retailer might sell those chairs, and the consumer might buy those chairs. Now, this is by no means the only supply chain that exists, but this is a common example. Okay? At the end of the day, with this example, the supply chain is end user driven. See, it's simple to measure. It's easy to see whether or not it makes sense. The consumer at the end of the day will decide whether or not the chairs are priced correctly, whether or not there is enough demand for the colors of chairs that are made, whether or not people need chairs anymore, whether or not wood chairs are good, whether or not metal chairs are required, whether or not they want to buy chairs that are made in China, whether they want to buy chairs that are made in South Africa. The end user will drive the supply chain. They will define what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. They will also decide, by way of demand, how much a chair should be priced, how easy a chair should be able to be bought in a store. Okay? What we have in terms of our human rights looks something like this. There are human rights documents, which are fantastic, and as one of the previous speakers said, almost meaningless as well. Okay, there's various programs and initiatives that may exist, but are confusing, to say the least. And then usually you see reapplication of these programs. Okay? It doesn't necessarily seem like there is a coordinated approach, and the drivers certainly don't seem to be the end users. Furthermore, there are distractions within the chain. Okay? These decisions on which programs and initiatives to use might be defined by budgets, might be constrained by political interaction, might be misunderstood by government interpretation. So what we have, as far as I'm concerned, is a set of human rights that are applied by way of interpretation, by way of programs that are initiated, but not necessarily by way of meeting the absolute need of the end user. Now, I have a theory. I have a theory that we should have a supply chain of human rights that looks something like this. There should be a human right. It should be measurable by geography. There should be goals attached to it. There should be the development of tools to hit these goals, to meet these objectives. There should be a coordinated application, a measurement, evaluation and correction, and a reapplication. Now, some of you are shaking your heads. You're probably thinking to yourself, this Harvard lecturer is talking about something that just doesn't make sense. And maybe you're right. But as far as I can see, this is a coordinated, structured approach. It has measurement, it's driven by an end user, and it has a flow to it. Okay? Throughout the process, the driver should be the final user. Now, what I'm basically saying can be illustrated in an example. Let's say, for example, we take a goal of ensuring education exists. Let's say we take a goal of having the population of Johannesburg have a 60% level, or 60% of the population of Johannesburg having a proper high school education. Okay, let's say a simple goal like that. Now, that might be kind of a monumental goal, and there might be all sorts of areas of confusion, but using this model, what we would basically do is we would define the goal. We would measure that goal. We would say, what exactly is proper education? Is proper education defining the education standards that we as South Africans hold true? Are there different forms of education? Is our standard accurate? We would define benchmarks for how to measure whether or not we're actually hitting the mark, whether or not we're actually meeting the goal. Okay, the next step would be to understand exactly what the root causes are for why this has not been met so far. Why is it that we don't have proper education? Why is it that 60% of the population isn't properly educated? Finally, we could go about defining and applying the tools to achieve this goal. That might be indirect measures, might be tutoring programs, might be transport for students to schools, might be ensuring that there's proper nourishment, ensuring that there's a proper culture of education that exists. And finally, after the application of these measures takes place, the application and the measurement of these applications should be timely. The initiatives must be placed, must be measured, must be understood, and the results must be made public. After this, evaluation of exactly what's been achieved and what's been missed must take place, and all of a sudden, we have a reapplication that aims to correct the mistakes that we made the first way around. Sounds like a pretty simple process, I know. But the process is defined in order to understand where we're going wrong and in order to assure that we, as a population, aim to meet a goal by defined metrics, aim to measure our progress, aim to correct our ways, and aim to reapply what we've learned. I believe strongly that this model, if it were to be accepted and applied, would not only meet the goal of defining human rights, but allow a population as a whole to realize, to achieve the human rights that we have so accurately defined. In order for human rights to make sense, they have to be driven by the population, they must be clear, they must be meaningful, they must be measurable, they must be applicable, and they must be a shared vision. My name is Zal Phiroz, and this is the supply chain of human rights. Thank you.